The war that erased a generation, a full history. He was one of 10 million soldiers who would never come home. This story starts like so many others, with a single gunshot in a city most people had never heard of. But that one shot would escalate into a global inferno that toppled empires and wiped out an entire generation. This is the story of the war that was supposed to end all wars, World War I. The Tinderbox. Before the first shot was fired, before a single trench was dug, early 20th century Europe was a continent of incredible progress and deeply rooted tension. On the surface, things looked bright. Cities were humming with new industry, railways were stitching nations together, and breakthroughs in science and art were happening every day. But under all that confidence, something dangerous was brewing. Europe was a room filled with gunpowder, just waiting for a spark. This tension really stood on four pillars, a framework historians call the main causes of the war: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. First, you have militarism. The great powers of Europe were trapped in a frantic arms race. Germany, a young and ambitious nation, started building a massive navy to challenge Great Britain's long-standing rule over the seas. Armies ballooned to unheard of sizes, and military planning wasn't just about defense anymore, it was a matter of national pride. A belief in the cult of the offensive took hold, especially in France and Germany, suggesting the best defense was a lightning-fast attack. Military leaders, with their complex mobilization timetables, thought that if war came, it would be fast and glorious. Second, a tangled mess of alliances. Decades of treaties had split the continent into two opposing teams. On one side were the Central Powers, mainly the powerful German Empire and the vast, multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire, bound by a pact of mutual defense. On the other were the Allied Powers, or Triple Entente: France, Russia, and Great Britain. France was still stinging from its defeat to Germany in 1871. Russia, which saw itself as the great protector of all Slavic peoples, was a natural rival to Austria-Hungary in the Balkans. And Britain, though reluctant, was deeply suspicious of Germany's growing power. These alliances were supposed to keep the peace, to create a balance of power. Instead, they created a tripwire. An attack on one meant an attack on all. Third, imperialism. The major powers had spent the last few decades carving up Africa and Asia, fighting over colonies, resources, and influence. This global scramble for empire fueled rivalries and created an atmosphere of deep mistrust. And finally, nationalism. All across Europe, intense national pride was boiling over into aggressive hostility. In France, it was about revenge against Germany. In Germany, it was a burning ambition for its place in the sun, but nowhere was nationalism more explosive than in the Balkans, the powder keg of Europe. Here, the crumbling Ottoman Empire had left a power vacuum, and newly independent states like Serbia had big dreams. Serbian nationalists wanted to create a Greater Serbia, uniting all South Slavs. The problem? Many of those Slavs lived inside the borders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which saw Serbia's dream as a direct threat to its very existence. This was Europe in 1914. A continent armed to the teeth, divided by alliances, driven by imperial competition, and inflamed by nationalism. It was a tinderbox waiting for a match. Section 2, The Spark and the Inferno. The match was finally struck on June 28, 1914. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie were visiting Sarajevo, the capital of the recently annexed province of Bosnia. It was a deliberately provocative visit on a day that held deep meaning for Serbian nationalists. Hiding in the crowds were a handful of assassins, trained and armed by a secret society with links to Serbian military intelligence. The first attempt on the Archduke's life that day failed. A bomb was thrown at his motorcade, but it bounced off his car and exploded under the next one. Shaken but determined, the Archduke decided to continue his schedule, even planning to visit the wounded officers in the hospital. But then, his driver made a fatal wrong turn. As he tried to reverse the car, it stalled. By a tragic, unbelievable coincidence, it stopped just 5 feet away from one of the conspirators, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip. He stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. One hit Sophie, the other struck the Archduke in the neck. Within minutes, they were both dead. The assassination started a ticking clock. Over the next month, a series of threats and mobilizations known as the July Crisis pulled Europe toward war. Austria-Hungary, set on crushing Serbian nationalism for good, got a blank check of unconditional support from its powerful ally, Germany. On July 23, it sent Serbia an ultimatum with demands so harsh they were practically designed to be rejected. When Serbia, as expected, couldn't agree to every single term, Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28, 1914. And then the dominoes started to fall, just as the alliance system guaranteed. Russia, seeing its Slavic ally threatened, began to mobilize its massive army. Germany saw Russia's mobilization as a direct threat and declared war on Russia on August 1. France, bound by its alliance to Russia, started mobilizing its own troops. Germany didn't wait. Facing the nightmare of a 2-front war, it declared war on France on August 3. Germany's battle plan, the infamous Schlieffen Plan, was all about speed. It aimed to knock France out of the war in 6 weeks by sweeping through neutral Belgium to bypass France's fortified border. But invading Belgium was a disastrous miscalculation. On August 4, Great Britain, honoring a 75-year-old treaty that guaranteed Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany. The powder keg of Europe had exploded. As millions of men across Europe enthusiastically answered the call to arms, a giddy optimism took hold. This would be a quick, glorious war. The soldiers would be home by Christmas. They marched off in a wave of patriotic passion, completely unaware they were marching toward a catastrophe that would change the world forever. Section 3. The Bloody Stalemate, the Western Front. The German army poured into Belgium and northern France in August 1914, a massive force that seemed unstoppable. But the Schlieffen Plan quickly started to fall apart. The Belgians resisted fiercely, buying the Allies precious time. The small but professional British Expeditionary Force arrived to help the French. And the Russians mobilized faster than anyone expected, forcing Germany to divert key troops to the Eastern Front. The turning point came in early September, just 30 miles from Paris. At the First Battle of the Marne, the exhausted German army was hit by a desperate Allied counterattack. In a legendary move, the French military governor of Paris requisitioned 600 of the city's taxicabs to rush thousands of reserve soldiers to the front. The German advance was stopped, Paris was saved, and the dream of a quick war died. What came next was the race to the sea, as each army tried to outflank the other, extending their lines north to the English Channel. But no one could break through. Instead, something new and awful began to scar the European landscape. To shield themselves from the devastating power of modern artillery and machine guns, soldiers on both sides started to dig. By November 1914, a continuous line of trenches stretched 475 miles, from the coast of Belgium to the Swiss border. The war of movement was over. The war of the trenches had begun. Life in this underground world was a special kind of hell. Trenches weren't just simple ditches. They were complex systems with a frontline trench, a support trench, and a reserve trench, all linked by a web of communication trenches. They were dug in a zigzag pattern so that an enemy soldier who got in couldn't fire straight down the line. But for the common soldier, life was universally miserable. The trenches were filthy, cramped, and terrifying. Rain turned the soil into a thick, inescapable mud that could literally swallow a man whole. Wooden planks called duckboards were laid down, but trenches often flooded, forcing men to stand for days in freezing, knee-deep water. This caused trench foot, a nasty fungal infection that could lead to gangrene and amputation. Pests were a constant torment. Lice bred in the seams of uniforms, causing a relentless itch and trench fever, but the rats were worse. Feasting on rations and the dead, they grew to enormous sizes and swarmed through the trenches without fear. The smell was overpowering, a foul mix of rot, overflowing latrines, disinfectant, sweat, and stale food. The noise never stopped. The constant, thunderous roar of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, and the screams of the wounded created a soundtrack of pure terror. For many, the psychological damage was as bad as any physical wound. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, shattered the minds of thousands, leaving them shaking, mute, or paralyzed. The daily routine was a monotonous cycle of fear. Days were spent huddled below the parapet, dodging snipers. The real work happened at night. Under the cover of darkness, men crept into no man's land, the blasted, crater-filled hell between the trenches, crisscrossed with thick tangles of barbed wire, to repair defenses, patrol, or conduct terrifying raids on enemy lines. The main tactic on the Western Front was the frontal assault. The idea was simple. A massive artillery bombardment, sometimes lasting for days, would smash the enemy's barbed wire and defenses. Then, the infantry would go over the top, climb out of their trenches, and charge across no man's land. It almost never worked. The shelling rarely destroyed all the wire and just churned no man's land into an even bigger mess. Worse, it was a giant announcement that an attack was coming, giving defenders time to get their machine guns ready. As the infantry advanced in slow lines, they were met with a storm of machine gun fire that could mow down hundreds of men in minutes. More than any other weapon, the machine gun came to define the brutal futility of trench warfare. Section 4, The Technology of Death. World War I was a horrifying collision of 19th century tactics and 20th century technology. Generals who learned to fight on horseback were now in charge of industrial-scale slaughter. The war became a gruesome laboratory for new ways to kill, each designed to break the stalemate, but each only making the killing more efficient. If one weapon ruled this battlefield, it was artillery. For the first time, armies could fire millions of high-explosive shells with terrifying accuracy over miles. The sheer volume of shellfire reshaped the landscape, obliterating forests and turning fields into moonscapes. The constant bombardments were meant to soften up enemy defenses, but they also shredded the bodies and minds of the men hiding in their dugouts. Then there was the machine gun asterisk. It had been used before, but in World War I it became the ultimate defensive weapon. A few well-placed machine guns could stop an attack by thousands, firing hundreds of rounds per minute and cutting down soldiers in waves. It was the weapon that forced armies into the ground and kept them there for 4 years. To try and break the tyranny of the trench and the machine gun, scientists turned to chemistry. On April 22, 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres, German forces released a creeping, greenish-yellow cloud of chlorine gas. It attacked the respiratory system, causing a horrible, suffocating death. It was a new dimension of terror. Soon, both sides developed even deadlier agents, like phosgene and mustard gas, which caused horrific blisters on the skin, in the eyes, and in the lungs. Gas was terrifying, but its military value was limited. It depended on the wind, and gas masks were quickly developed as a defense. While some technologies killed from a distance, others took the fight to the skies. At the start of the war, airplanes were flimsy things used mostly for scouting. But they evolved at a breathtaking pace. Pilots started by taking shots at each other with pistols. Soon, planes were fitted with machine guns, giving birth to the dogfight and the fame of flying aces like Germany's Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. But for all the romance of aerial duels, the most important job for aircraft was spotting for artillery, directing the big guns on the ground with deadly precision. Finally, there was the one weapon designed specifically to break the stalemate, the tank. Developed in secret by the British, the tank was imagined as a landship, an armored vehicle on caterpillar tracks that could cross no man's land, crush barbed wire, and shrug off machine gun fire. The first tanks were used at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. They were slow, unreliable, and terrifying for their own crews, but they were also a glimpse of the future. In the last year of the war, massed tank attacks would be key to finally breaking through the German lines. These new technologies didn't deliver the quick victory anyone hoped for. Instead, they industrialized warfare, turning the battlefields into a vast, efficient machine for killing. Section 5, the Year of Blood. Verdun and the Somme. This was the year the industrial slaughter on the Western Front reached its terrifying peak. It was the year of two gigantic battles, names that would forever be linked with pointless carnage: Verdun and the Somme. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, had a new, sinister strategy. He decided to attack a place so vital to French national pride that France would have no choice but to defend it to the last man. His target was the ancient fortress city of Verdun. Falkenhayn's goal wasn't to capture the city, it was to bleed the French army white. It was a pure battle of attrition, designed to kill so many French soldiers that the country would be forced to give up. The attack began on February 21, 1916, with one of the most intense artillery bombardments in history. Over 1 million shells fell on the French positions in the first day alone. One French soldier described it: men were squashed, cut in two or divided top to bottom, blown into showers, bellies turned inside out. German stormtroopers advanced with flamethrowers, and the French lines began to crumble. But they didn't break. The French commander, General Philippe Pétain, rallied his men with the cry, "They shall not pass." An endless stream of men and supplies was funneled into the Verdun meat grinder along a single road that became known as the Voie Sacrée, or the Sacred Way. For 10 agonizing months, the two armies tore each other apart. When the battle finally ended in December, the front lines had barely moved. The cost was unbelievable: over 700,000 casualties, split almost evenly between both sides. Verdun became a symbol of French defiance, but at a price that would haunt the nation for generations. While the French were being bled dry at Verdun, their British allies planned their own massive attack on the River Somme. The goal was to relieve the pressure on the French and, they hoped, finally achieve that decisive breakthrough. The British commander, General Douglas Haig, was confident. His plan hinged on a week-long artillery bombardment of 1.5 million shells to destroy the German defenses. On the morning of July 1, 1916, the whistles blew, and 120,000 British soldiers climbed out of their trenches. They were met with a storm of machine gun and artillery fire. The bombardment had failed. It hadn't cut the German barbed wire or destroyed their deep, concrete dugouts. As the British troops advanced slowly, weighed down by heavy gear, they were slaughtered. July 1, 1916 remains the single bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. By nightfall, there were over 57,000 British casualties, with nearly 20,000 dead. Despite the catastrophe of the first day, Haig kept pushing. For the next 4.5 months, the battle raged on, a grim series of attacks that descended into a muddy, bloody slugfest. The battle finally ended in November. The Allies had advanced a mere 6 miles. The price for this tiny patch of ground was over 1 million casualties on all sides. Verdun and the Somme were the horrifying embodiment of the war's futility. They were battles fought on an industrial scale, where human lives were spent like bullets, fed into a machine that consumed a generation and left nothing behind but fields of graves. Section 6, the Global War and the Home Front. While the horror of the Western Front dominates our memory, World War I was a truly global conflict. The great empires pulled in men and resources from their colonies, and fighting raged across Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. On the Eastern Front, the sheer scale was even bigger. The massive armies of Germany and Austria-Hungary fought against the sprawling, badly equipped forces of the Russian Empire. The fighting here was more mobile than in the West, with huge territories changing hands, but the slaughter was just as bad. Early, catastrophic defeats for the Russians drained the country of men and resources, setting the stage for revolution. In 1915, the Allies tried to break the deadlock by opening a new front. In a campaign championed by Winston Churchill, they launched a naval and land assault to seize the Gallipoli Peninsula in the Ottoman Empire. The goal was to knock Turkey out of the war and open a supply line to Russia. But the landings, carried out by British, French, and a large force of Australian and New Zealand troops, the Anzacs, were met with fierce Turkish resistance. The campaign bogged down into its own brutal form of trench warfare. After 8 months of bloody failure, the Allies evacuated, having suffered over 250,000 casualties in a humiliating defeat. The war also raged at sea. Great Britain set up a naval blockade of Germany, slowly cutting off its access to food and raw materials. Germany fought back with a terrifying new weapon, the U-boat, or submarine. In a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, German U-boats began sinking merchant ships without warning. This hit a critical point on May 7, 1915, when a U-boat torpedoed the British passenger liner Lusitania, killing nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. The act sparked international outrage and started to turn American public opinion against Germany. Back on the home front, the war changed everything. This was the first total war, demanding the complete mobilization of entire nations. Governments seized control of their economies, ordering factories to produce munitions instead of household goods. Food was rationed. Propaganda posters were everywhere, urging people to buy war bonds, save food, and hate the enemy. The war also transformed the role of women. With millions of men at the front, women stepped up. They went to work in factories, on farms, and in offices to keep the war economy going. They worked in dangerous munitions factories, where the chemicals they handled turned their skin yellow, earning them the name Canary Girls. They served as nurses near the front lines, witnessing the horrors of war up close. This vital contribution to the war effort helped speed up the push for women's right to vote in Britain and other countries after the war. Section 7. The Turning Points: America's Entry and Russia's Exit. The year 1917 brought two huge events that would finally break the agonizing stalemate and seal the fate of the Central Powers. Russia left the war, and the United States entered it. Russia had been shattered by the war. With staggering casualties, severe food shortages, and a corrupt government, the country was breaking apart. In March 1917, riots in Petrograd exploded into a full-blown revolution. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. The new government tried to keep fighting, but the army and the people were done. In November 1917, Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power, promising the people peace, land, and bread. In March 1918, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, officially pulling Russia out of the war. Russia's exit was a huge win for Germany. It could now move hundreds of thousands of veteran troops from the Eastern Front to the West, hoping for one final, knockout blow before the Americans could make a difference. But just as Russia was leaving, the United States was finally getting in. America had been officially neutral since 1914, and President Woodrow Wilson had even won re-election with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But American sympathies had been slowly shifting to the Allies, fueled by anger over Germany's submarine warfare. The final straws came in early 1917. First, Germany announced it was resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, gambling it could starve Britain before the US could mobilize. Then, British intelligence intercepted a secret message from Germany's Foreign Secretary, Arthur Zimmermann, to Mexico. The Zimmermann telegram proposed a military alliance. If the US entered the war, Germany would help Mexico reclaim Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When the telegram was published, it caused an uproar in America. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson went before Congress and asked for a declaration of war, proclaiming that the world must be made safe for democracy. On April 6, the United States was officially in the war. America's entry was a crushing blow to German morale and a massive boost for the exhausted Allies. The US brought its incredible industrial power and, most importantly, a vast supply of fresh soldiers. It would take months to get the American Expeditionary Force to Europe, but their arrival set off a desperate race against time. Germany now had one last chance to win before the full weight of American power came crashing down. Section 8, The End and the Echoes. With Russia out of the picture, German General Erich Ludendorff knew he had one last shot. In the spring of 1918, he launched a series of 5 massive attacks known as the Kaiserschlacht, or the Emperor's Battle. Using new, stormtrooper, tactics, small, elite units bypassed strongpoints to punch deep into the Allied rear. The German spring offensive began on March 21, 1918, with a monstrous artillery barrage. For the first time in years, the front was broken wide open. The Germans pushed forward over 40 miles, their biggest gain since 1914, and once again threatened Paris. But it was a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. The German army took huge casualties, and its supply lines couldn't keep up. The Allied lines bent, but they didn't break. And now, fresh American troops were pouring in, playing a vital role in stopping the German advance at key battles like Château Thierry and Belleau Wood. By July, the German offensive had run out of steam. The tide had turned for the last time. On August 8, 1918, the Allies launched their own counter-offensive, the 100 Days Offensive. Using a coordinated storm of infantry, artillery, hundreds of tanks, and air power, the Allies began to systematically shove the German army back. The German lines, stretched to the breaking point and manned by exhausted men and boys, started to crumble. Ludendorff himself later called August 8 the Black Day of the German army. At home, the Central Powers were falling apart. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires were collapsing from within. In Germany, the British naval blockade had caused widespread starvation and civil unrest. With his armies in full retreat and his allies giving up, the German High Command finally admitted the war was lost and told the Kaiser to ask for an armistice. Revolts broke out across Germany, and on November 9, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled. A new German Republic was declared. At 5 a.m. on November 11, 1918, in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne, representatives from the new German government signed the armistice. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns on the Western Front fell silent. The war was over. The world that emerged from the wreckage was shattered. 4 great empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman, were gone. The human cost was almost beyond imagination. Around 10 million soldiers were dead, with another 20 million wounded. Millions of civilians also died from disease, starvation, and persecution. An entire generation of young men, the lost generation, was gone, leaving a hole in families and communities across the globe. In 1919, the victorious leaders met at the Palace of Versailles to forge the peace. But the resulting Treaty of Versailles was a deeply flawed peace. Driven by a desire for revenge, especially from France, the treaty slapped brutal terms on Germany. Germany was forced to accept total blame for the war in the infamous War Guilt Clause, lose all its colonies and huge chunks of its own territory, slash its military, and pay crippling financial reparations. Instead of creating a lasting peace, the treaty bred deep bitterness and humiliation in Germany, creating the perfect environment for the rise of extremism. The peace of 1919, as one observer put it, was just an armistice for 20 years. It solved almost none of the problems that started the war and created a whole new set of grievances that would pave the way for an even deadlier conflict just 2 decades later. The First World War was a cataclysm that destroyed the old world and defined the 20th century. It was a war of unimaginable brutality, a conflict that introduced the horrors of industrial slaughter and left a scar of trauma and loss that we can still feel today. It began with naive optimism and ended in a wasteland of ruins, having consumed millions of lives. The generation that fought and died in the mud of Flanders and the forests of the Argonne was lost forever, a sacrifice that tragically failed to build the lasting peace it was meant to achieve. It was, and always will be, the war that erased a generation. If you want to keep exploring the pivotal moments that shaped our world, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell. Let us know in the comments which part of World War I you find the most compelling or tragic. Thanks for watching.